slipped in some Linda Brent, who has a local connection, of course, Harriet Jacobs, and so many others in here. I think the longest was William Wells Brown. You got William Wells Brown here, man. And in this book, African and Caribbean people in Britain, so many people make an appearance. Sorry, Bartman isn't here. Bartman is here. Okay. And of course, you would expect Garveys, of course, and Padmores and Ras McConnens, but you go back to prehistory. So I hope you'll show us in about 30 seconds. And I'm going to mention, as I take my seat, a few of his other books, which you can purchase here at Sankofa. And since everybody's streaming, you need to exhaust the bookshelves. West Africans in Britain, 1900 to 1960, Nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and Communism, Pan-African History, Political Figures from Africa and the Diaspora since 1787, and Pan-Africanism and History, which if you're teaching an intro class in Pan-Africanism, or really in many ways any form people call it African Diaspora Studies, I'm not quite sure what that is, but you can use this book, Pan-Africanism. So without further ado, Professor Hakim Adi back at Sankofa. Welcome, brothers.
Okay, well, it's always a great pleasure to be back here. And I just want to thank everybody at Sankofa for organizing the event, and especially all of you for coming out on a beautiful Thursday evening. Everybody has other things to do, maybe more interesting or more important things to do, but it's very good to see all of you here. You've already heard from Greg, and again I have to thank Greg. It's one of the reasons I love to come to Sankofa, is I have Greg introducing me in his inimitable style, and that's just come for that is sufficient. I'm very, very happy to introduce my book to you. As you heard, we have some problems obtaining copies. I don't really want to speak about publishers. Those who know me would know that I have a great dislike of all publishers, and with good reason, because they generally treat books, and particularly authors, as if we don't matter. They don't like selling books, distributing books, or promoting books, and that's unfortunately been the case with this launch event. So I don't want to dwell on that. I just want to tell you something about the book and maybe the reasons for writing it. As you heard, I was asked by the publishers to produce the book. Originally, it was there was a slightly different intention to make it quite a small book, but I decided that it was important to produce something a little bit more comprehensive, mainly because this history had not really been presented in that way for over 40 years. And in that 40 years, a lot of new research and investigation had been done, which hadn't been presented in a form that was easily accessible to people. So the aim of this book was to present all of the material that now exists on this very long history, so that people want to search for something, they can find it. There's footnotes there, there are references to websites, all the kinds of information that people could possibly need. So it's impossible for me to go through and kind of summarize nearly 700 pages and 10,000 years of history. The book covers about 10,000 years of history. But I'm going to try to present some of it just through images, some of the images that appear in the book. I think there are about 50 different photos and other images in the book. So I'm going to show you some of them and try to explain to you some of this history. Some of it you may be familiar with, some I thought to begin, let's just see if I can. Wow, that's a good start. Wasn't keep forgetting about that step. Okay, let me come over here so everyone can see a bit more easily. I just thought I'd start with, okay, maybe let me come over here. It's a bigger drop here.
You want to move thing over there? Oh, I guess
Not really, it's probably better there because otherwise we'll be in the way. So I thought I'd just introduce what I'm going to say with this quote from J. Rogers. Because often we tend to think that the history of those of African heritage in the US and in Britain are very different histories. But of course there are important similarities. And J. Rogers highlights one of the important, if you like, connecting factors, if you like, which is that you can say we face the same, what shall I say, the same enemy, essentially. The same political system, the same economic system, the same systems of oppression and exploitation. And so this quote perhaps introduces that in terms of focusing on racism in particular and its origins. And I say a little bit more about it in the book. But just to begin with this connection, that there are many things that we share, but there are also some important differences. So we'll try and highlight some of those differences. Okay, let's go on with the next slide, please. Okay, so I'm not going to go back 10,000 years, but just about 2,000 years or nearly 2,000 years. So Africans have been in Britain for at least 2,000 years. And one problem that we have with the way that history is represented in Britain is usually Africans are excluded from that history. So very similar problems to the problems that you face here. That history is often presented as a history of what we'd say the white men of property. So we have exactly the same problem in Britain. But in recent years there have been some very important scientific discoveries, and one of them is represented in this image. So this is an image from Roman Britain, a reconstruction, obviously, because it's quite a long time ago. And so this is a reconstruction of a skeleton of a woman who lived in the city of York about 1700 years ago, something like that. She was clearly an African woman. She is known as Ivory Bangle Lady. Again, as I say, this is a reconstruction from DNA evidence. And what this reconstruction shows is that Africans were present in Roman times. And this is just one example. There are many others. It's an important example because she was young, a woman, somebody of, we can say, high status, buried with her jewelry and so on. And sometimes in history, particularly when one goes back hundreds of years, when there is any evidence of Africans being found anywhere in the world outside of Africa in particular, it's always the immediate assumption is that these people were enslaved or were of some inferior status and so on. And actually the historic truth is quite different from that. And this picture gives us evidence of that. And in fact, in every century onwards, from the 3rd century AD, we find evidence of African people in Britain. I haven't got time to go into all of the discoveries, but you'll have to take my word for it. In fact, only a couple of months ago, a new discovery was made in southeast England of the burial of a young child, about 8 or 9 years of age. And today with DNA analysis, it's possible to trace people's origins quite precisely. So they said that this child, her DNA could be traced back to West Africa. In fact, they even went much further than that and said this was a person of Yoruba heritage. Maybe she didn't directly come, but probably her father or possibly her grandfather came from that part of West Africa. Why they were in Britain in the 7th century, what they were doing, how we got there, we don't yet know. But this is the kind of evidence that's being discovered all the time, and all the latest information, evidence, is presented in the first chapter or first 2 chapters of the book. Okay, let's go on. Actually, before we go on, this sounds like very, kind of matter-of-fact information. But in fact, for presenting this information, there are people in Britain who spend their whole time attacking me. even putting videos on YouTube saying that I'm trying to brainwash people, particularly children, because some of this information is also in the children's book that I wrote many, many years ago. So although this seems like just everyday information, for some people, especially those who are openly racist, these this basic factual information is something they're very concerned about, but actually very frightened of. Anyway, we can go into that later, why history has this peculiar quality. Okay, let's go on to the next one, yeah, please. Okay, so I'm going to move on a few hundred years to Tudor England, Elizabethan England, and if you know anything about television in Britain, you'll know that the Tudor period, the period of Shakespeare, Elizabeth I, and so on, is one of the periods that people love to portray in various TV series, but usually without Africans. So here we have very definite evidence, and this is an original image from around about 1511. And we actually know the name of this man. His name was John Blank, or he was called John Blank, which may not have been his real name. He was a trumpeter in the service of the royal court of that period. We know something about him, that he was married, that he was perhaps the first African to demand a wage increase, and that he successfully got that wage increase, and some other things about it. And we know that there were hundreds of other Africans in Britain at that time, doing a variety of occupations, property owners, skilled craftspeople, a range of things. So again, however far back we go, that we have this African presence and Africans playing a very interesting role in Britain's history. Anyway, I could say much more about that because I've got so much to get through. Let's move on to the next slide and we can come back to it later. Okay, this one, it's a bit difficult to see here, but I'm moving on now to probably the 17th century, late 17th century. And in this period, obviously, there's a transformation is taking place in the world. And that transformation is in the relationship between Africa and Europe. As you know, before that period, if we go back to Tudor times in the picture, the last picture I showed, the relationship between Africa and Europe was more or less one of, we can say, of equality. In fact, if we just look in terms of economic development, social development, political development, we could find parts of Africa that are much more advanced than parts of Europe and so on. But in the next few hundred years, that relationship changed for reasons that we're all very familiar with. And this is an illustration of that change. This is a Scottish aristocrat. We don't need to worry too much about who he was. But it became the fashion in the 18th century for those of wealth and property to own Africans. And this wasn't just something that happened here or in the Caribbean. Of course, it was something that happened in Britain because it was those from Britain who were establishing colonies here and in other parts of the world. And so you very often would find images like this because the ownership of Africans was also considered, obviously, a sign of wealth and prestige. And African boys and girls, like this young boy, were kept as essentially as household pets. And you can just about see that this young boy is wearing a collar. That was very common. They often were given pet names, and these particular owners very often used Roman names, Caesar and Pompey and these kinds of things. So by the time we get to 17th and 18th century, this was quite common, and slavery was a common feature of life in Britain. Not slavery as you might have found it in the US or in this part of the US, because there was no large-scale use of enslaved Africans in agriculture and so on. But certainly in domestic settings, in people's homes, especially those of the rich, you would have found Africans, enslaved Africans. You would also find, I'm not showing it here, you'd find wanted posters for people who had liberated themselves by removing themselves, by escaping, and so on. You would find adverts for auctions, and you'd find Africans being auctioned alongside alcohol or cloth or so on. And in Britain this happened probably in the same way it did here, but certainly in places like coffee houses and so on. So this was common in this period. Okay, let's have the next slide, please. So how did this transformation come about? Well, there are various ways of looking at it, but I'm just going to give you an illustration by talking about an example. So this gentleman's name was William Answer, or he's known as William Answer. He came from what is today Ghana. Of course, Ghana didn't exist at that time. And it was the fashion already by the 18th century. This portrait is from about 1750. It was the fashion at that time for wealthy and enlightened Africans to send their sons abroad to be educated. So William's father, being an enlightened man, wanted his son to be educated in England. It's a tradition that still exists to this day. And so he sent him off with somebody he thought was a trustworthy companion. Now, I forgot to mention that William's father, although he was enlightened as far as education was concerned, was less enlightened in regard to other circumstances, because he was also somebody who traded in other enslaved Africans. Okay, so he sent his son off to England with a ship's captain. That ship captain turned out to be rather unscrupulous. He kidnapped William, he took him to Barbados, and he sold him into slavery. So William's father was rather upset that somebody had enslaved his son. He didn't think it was unreasonable to enslave other people's sons. But when it happened to his own son, he thought it was incredibly unreasonable. So he wrote to his business associates, who went under the name of the Royal Africa Company. You know that all the monarchs in Britain were engaged. In fact, they were the leaders of human trafficking throughout the centuries. In fact, from Elizabeth Tudor right up until William IV, they were all engaged in human trafficking. And you know today, I know some of you are interested in the monarchy. And you know the monarchy has tremendous wealth. I think the monarchy is valued in Forbes at something like 29 billion. Of course, they didn't pay for their own coronation, but that's another thing. But you might have wondered where that wealth comes from. Anyway, you can guess where it came from. Some of it, anyway. So anyway, going back to William. So William's father wrote to the Royal Africa Company, sent his emissary, said, "What's going on? My son's being kidnapped. Unless you bring him back immediately, there will be no more human trafficking from my part of West Africa." So the Royal Africa Company, very concerned about this cessation of trade, they immediately sent their guys to Barbados. They found William. They brought him back to London immediately. They gave him this rather nice suit of clothes. They accommodated him in the house of the president of the Board of Trade, who was the government minister responsible for human trafficking. He stayed in London for a holiday for about a year, a little bit more. They took him to the theatre, took him to the opera, had a good time. At the end of that period, he was taken back to West Africa to his father. He said, "Thank you very much. Now human trafficking can recommence." So this transformation which took place, we sometimes think of it just as the activities of the rich and powerful in Europe. But of course it couldn't have been conducted without the rich and powerful, some of them in Africa at the same time. So that's very important to remember. Okay, let's go on with the next one. Well, talking about monarchy as I was, this image actually comes from the Royal Collection. And I had a word with Charles the other day. I said, "I've come into Sankofa and talk about history." He said, "Well, Hakim, you must take this picture to show the people." So I brought it to show you tonight. This is an interesting one, and this is another royal trumpeter from one of the household regiments. Very unusual to see an African in one of the household regiments today. The last one I can remember resigned because he said there was too much racism in that particular branch of the army. But in the 18th century, it was very common to have African soldiers as trumpeters, drummers, and so on. And we have to remember all the major battles, the late 17th century, 18th century, Waterloo, Trafalgar, all of them had African soldiers, African sailors, and so on. Recruited in Africa, also recruited in the Caribbean, and of course, before the mid-18th century, recruited in North America as well. So that was very common. What happened?
Charles, British intelligence.
You got a connection?
While we wait, the household regiment. What's a household regiment?
Household regiments are, I don't know whether you ever see in June, round about the second weekend of June, there is something in Britain which is called trooping the colour, where it's essentially a marching display where the troops are, can't remember the technical term, but they're kind of reviewed by the monarch. And some of the regiments in the British Army are known as household regiments, which means they have a particularly close relationship with the monarch. And so that particular image is of somebody who was a trumpeter in one of those regiments. So I don't know exactly how many regiments like that there are, but you know what the problem is, Michaela?
What's the problem?
I don't know, I'm asking you. I said, do you know what it is? If you don't know what it is, you won't be able to solve it. So we need to find someone who does know what it is. Does anybody know what the problem is? Okay, I'm going to ask some questions to the audience while we're waiting. So I see that. Okay, you found all the images. Which one are you looking at?
Well, we were just commenting on this one and how you can almost not see the young black.
Yeah, I mean that's. I don't know what the issue is with the original image. Whether it was always that dark or it's just age.
No, I assumed that it was on purpose because he was not as important as a man.
Maybe, but that's. You do find other images which maybe they're a bit clearer. I'm not sure why that one is particularly dark. It may just be how it's been reproduced. I don't think it's deliberate in that sense. Because the idea was actually to show off your wealth, as it were, or for them to show off their wealth. Okay, so I'll just carry on as it. Yeah?
Do you find that there is a bit of a romanticizing of the more recent movies or TV shows with Africans in the royal from 200 years ago in the within the monarchy in different roles? Like there was a recent movie here. Do you find that it's a true? Well, I don't think it's a true depiction of it, but what do you think of the ways in which it's made to make you feel like prejudice or racism didn't exist?
Well, it depends a little bit on which period you're looking at. if you go back to the 18th century, for example, which I was just mentioning, you can find a whole variety of experiences. So some people would have been literally held in slavery in the 18th century in Britain. As I said, you'll find auction posters, you'll find posters for those who ran away demanding their return, and so on. At the same time, you would also find, and I'll show an image maybe, if we get images
They're going
back.
to get a coordinate, so they're going to
Okay.
just go direct.
Okay. You could find people of African heritage in some of the most important households of the country, living in those households as the relations of some of the most important people in Britain. You would find, if you look at, for example, if you look at the kind of records that historians look at, you can look at this online. We have a very famous court in London called the Old Bailey. It's known as the Old Bailey. And it has a website that you can search. So if you search that website, you will find lots of different examples of people of African heritage. You will obviously, it's a court record. So you'll find people there who were criminals in the sense that they were poor. They needed to rob other people in order to survive. So women who were, worked on the streets in various capacities and so on. But you'll also find African people who were victims of crimes, who were robbed. And those who robbed them were sentenced for robbing them. And you'll find that those who were robbed had money and other possessions that they could be robbed of. They were workers, they were seafarers and so on. You'll find Africans in those records who are giving their testimony as witnesses. You'll find Africans who were police officers. So you find lots of different, and sometimes it's even difficult to work out whether they are Africans because it's not necessarily said in the reports of those cases. Or sometimes it says a Negro, or somebody's called black something, or whatever it is. So even at that time, you'll find a whole variety of experiences, not just one experience. So not just an experience of racism, well, that clearly existed, but also lots of other experiences as well. The other thing we have to remember is, this is true here just as in Britain, we're often told, or it's presented to us, a history of racism, of racist crimes of various kinds. But wherever there's racism, there's anti-racism. There's a struggle against those crimes, which is often very widespread. And so, for instance, you find examples, I think I mentioned it in the book, of British people helping Africans to escape. And in fact, the slave owners complained that actually if you bring these Africans to Britain, then other people, they said they became intoxicated with liberty. They are influenced and persuaded by other people in England, particularly servants and working people, that they should escape. And we know that those people helped Africans escape, and that Africans helped each other to escape and organize themselves in various ways. So within a society, you find lots of different experiences and examples, not just one. And I guess the job of a historian is to try and make a summation of that so that we get an accurate picture of what goes on. Just to give you another example, Greg was mentioning Equiano, and some of you are probably familiar with Equiano because he was here for a while. Some people even argue that he was born here, or one person argues that he was born here, and that his whole autobiography was just a concoction. And I don't know how many of you have read that important autobiography, but if it's fiction, then it's one of the greatest works of fiction that was ever written, certainly was ever written by an African. And it makes you wonder, if it was a work of fiction, how was it constructed? Was it constructed collectively? did Africans get together and pool their resources and pool their experiences and so on and so forth. So anyway, Equiano was, amongst other things, and Equiano is an interesting personality because we like to think of him always in a positive light. So we don't dwell on his relationship with human trafficking, which of course he mentions quite openly in his autobiography. Because, you know, the circumstances people are born into or find themselves thrust into are not always the ideal ones. But Equiano, when he was in Britain, was a leading campaigner, a leading activist, a leading abolitionist. And one of the interesting things about Britain's history is that this campaign for abolition, which Equiano was played a key role in, is very rarely mentioned. Of course, other people are mentioned, Wilberforce and all these kind of people in Parliament and so on. But the actual popular campaign, which involved, for the first time, women, it involved working people, it involved Africans, that's very rarely spoken of. But it's one of the biggest political movements that ever took place in Britain. And literally millions of people signed petitions, boycotted the consumption of sugar in order to campaign against human trafficking of Africans. So this massively important campaign, as I say, is hardly ever mentioned in Britain. Very, very rare, almost never. It's not taught in schools and so on. So this is, you could say, a kind of high point of Britain's history. That millions of ordinary people took this stand. And the fact that it's hardly ever mentioned, almost never mentioned, one makes one immediately think, well, why is that? Why is history presented in this particular way? And who does this presentation of history favour? Because it doesn't favour Africans, it doesn't favour the majority of people in Britain, the workers or women or so on. So much of the history which is contained in this book is like that. It's been erased, it's been whitewashed out, it's been written out, it's been ignored. And why? This is just a part of Britain's history. It's a part of the history of Africa, the diaspora, the Caribbean, and so on. And in the book, there are also those figures who, as Greg said, are, we can say, were, you know, key African American figures, particularly in the 19th century, who were also in Britain, because everybody came to Britain. And not only did they come, they often wrote about their experiences in Britain, which is why I was able to put them in the book of Black Voices. So Fred Douglass, well, you know Fred Douglass was in Britain. Fred Douglass's freedom was actually bought for him in Britain, much to the disgust of those people here. And he was like a superstar in Britain. Everywhere he went, everybody wanted to, you know, meet him, especially all the young ladies and so on. And he spent a lot of time in Britain, campaigning on various questions, just as he did here. He campaigned on women's rights, he campaigned on, obviously, abolitionist causes, as well as others.
Could you say something about, because you write about the legal cases. A minute ago you mentioned black people coming to Britain, and there's no positive law on the books. When you talk about Uncle Somerset, for example, the Somerset case, could you tie the U.S. and Great Britain together in terms of this debate on slavery? Because you mentioned Gerald Horne. I mean, there's kind of people saying now, oh, it wasn't Somerset's case, and they weren't going to abolish slavery. So, you know, just, you know, since we're over here in the colonies,
Sure.
What's the relationship?
Yeah, I was going to go into all of that because the image, I was going to show you an image related to that. Anyway, maybe we'll get the images back. If not, I'll just keep talking. So the Somerset case, I don't know if some of you may be familiar with it at the end of the 18th century. It's seen as a, let me just explain, as I said before, that slavery existed in Britain. Just as it did here, though, it was of a different kind normally. But legally, the law was a little bit ambiguous. And of course, Britain had, we can say, essentially two types of laws. It had laws relating to enslavement and slavery, in its colonies, whether that was in North America or whether in the Caribbean or elsewhere. There was obviously legislation which said people were bound into slavery and so on and so forth. But in Britain, there was no specific law. Great. Good work. Okay, next image, please. And absolute, you see how it was absolute time to perfection. How did you manage that? So we're talking about, just going to talk about the Somerset case. So this image relates to the Somerset case. So the Somerset case is concerned with a guy called James Somerset, an African man called James Somerset. And it's a famous case because throughout the 18th century, the law on slavery in Britain was tested. And it was tested largely by Africans. Because Africans would be brought into Britain as slaves from wherever, from here or from the Caribbean and so on. But when they actually got to Britain, there was no law that really related to their status. And so it was contested. They would liberate themselves by removing themselves from that position. They would run away. And then their owners, in inverted commas, would try and reclaim them. And very often these issues would end up in court. Were Africans property or not property? And obviously it was more than just individuals, there were a whole other. And the courts gave varying judgments. So some judges said, okay, well, yes, somebody's brought as a slave, yes, as a slave. Other judges said, well, no, there's no slavery in Britain, and so on. So these legal contests continued throughout the 18th century. And then they came to this famous judgment in 1772, which is known as the Somerset case, after James Somerset. And that case was presided over by the Lord Chief Justice of England, Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. Now, the woman in the picture here on the left is the niece of Lord Chief Justice Mansfield. Her name was Elizabeth Dido Lindsay. You've probably seen the film about it. There's a film called Belle, which I haven't seen, but you may have seen it. So anyway, she was the niece of the Lord Chief Justice. Now, in this judgment, which was essentially a judgment about the status of James Somerset, Mansfield made a judgment which essentially didn't deal with the issue of slavery as an institution in Britain, but dealt with dealt with the legality of kidnapping a person such as James Somerset. And essentially what he ruled was that it was illegal for somebody to be kidnapped. So essentially, if you liberated yourself by running away from your owner did not then have the legal right to kidnap you and take you back to Virginia or take you back to Jamaica. That was illegal, according to Mansfield. So at the time, this judgment, some people considered that it meant the end of slavery in Britain, but it didn't. And in fact, there were many, many cases after that. And Mansfield himself said that, and many other people said it. The significance of it was, of course, for Britain that it, if you like, rewarded those Africans who liberated themselves. It gave legal sanction, if you like, to their self-liberation. But it also, as Greg indicated, it kind of reverberated around the colonies, including here. That okay, well, this kind of precedent had been set that Africans had won their freedom and so on. And there was even correspondence between Africans in various parts of the world that this judgment had happened and so on. So it was celebrated in Britain and in other places at the time as being an important judgment. It did have its importance, but it was limited in that importance. And in fact, slavery existed in Britain right up until 1833. And there are examples in the 19th century of Africans being brought into Britain as enslaved people. And remaining in that status. Of course, in the colonies, whether it was here or whether it was in the Caribbean, there were very, very different circumstances. So that's essentially the case, and that's the connection with Elizabeth Dido Lindsay. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, well, here is Equiano. So I've already mentioned everything about him, so we'll move on. The one thing I didn't say about him was, okay, what was the politics of Equiano? So Equiano, as well as being an abolitionist, established one of the first Pan-African organizations, certainly in Britain, called the Sons of Africa, along with other Africans, and they campaigned against human trafficking and for the rights of Africans more generally. But interestingly, Equiano was also a member of the London Corresponding Society, which was a kind of radical working class organization, one of the first that period. And it was led by a man called Thomas Hardy. And Equiano actually lived with Thomas Hardy and his wife for a time. And this is a letter from Thomas Hardy to a particular person who had been introduced to him by Equiano. And you know that Equiano was known as Gustavus Vassa, his slave name. So this is an interesting insight into the kind of politics of the period. So Thomas Hardy writes to this guy, as you can see, he says, blah, 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 there you can see. He says, I see that you are a zealous friend to the abolition of that cursed traffic, the slave trade. I infer from that circumstance that you are a zealous friend to freedom on the broad basis of the rights of man. I am fully persuaded that there is no man who is from principle an advocate for the liberty of the black man, but will zealously support the rights of the white man and vice versa. So this was the politics of the 18th century. If you're for the rights of black people, then you should be for the rights of white people too. If you're for the rights of white people, you should be for the rights of black people too. In other words, you should be for the rights of all. You can't struggle for the rights of some and not struggle for the rights of others. So that's 18th century. So now we're in 21st century. But some people still haven't got to this level yet. Okay, so that's the politics of Equiano, Thomas Hardy, and the London Corresponding Society. And of course they were banned by the government as a subversive organisation. So I'm going to move into the 19th century as we're talking about fighting for the rights of man, or for human rights. So this gentleman's name was William Cuffy. He was the son of a guy from the Caribbean, actually a seafarer. William Cuffy was born in 1788. He's famous as one of the leaders of the Chartist movement. The Chartist movement was the first working class movement in Britain, the first national working class movement. They were called the Chartists because they demanded, they made 6 demands as part of their charter. Right to vote. In this period in the 19th century, most people in Britain did not have the right to vote or any other rights for that matter. So William Cuffy was one of their leaders in London. You probably know that when Fred Douglass came to Britain, he said, I am a Chartist. And I always like to imagine that William Cuffy and Fred Douglass meeting somewhere, but I don't think they did. There's no evidence that they did. So anyway, William Cuffy was eventually arrested. And in those days, it was very common for those arrested for a whole variety of crimes to be transported. He was transported to Australia along with his wife, and he lived for the rest of his life in Tasmania as a political activist. In those days, as in these days, political activists and their organizations were often infiltrated by the police. They're betrayed on dubious evidence, which is what happened to him. But he was just one of those in the 19th century of African heritage or Caribbean heritage who fought for the rights of all people at that time. Okay, let's go on to the next one because we're a long way to go. Okay, well, I said I'd started to talk about African Americans in Britain. And this is one of the most famous of them, Ira Aldridge. Some of you will be familiar with him, the famous Shakespearean actor. He came to Britain in the 1820s, and he loved Britain so much he became a British citizen. He's famous, as I said, for his Shakespearean roles. And as you probably know, Shakespeare actually didn't write that many roles for Africans or people of African heritage. So our audience had special makeup. He whited up, I suppose would be the expression, in order to play anyway, Lear, Macbeth, whatever, all these characters. It's said that at the end of his performance, and he actually did more than acting, he was a theatre manager, he did a whole range of things. And of course he toured throughout Europe. He came under attack in the press for the usual reasons that you can imagine, but a very prominent and famous actor. It's said that at the end of his performances, his Shakespearean performances, that he would get out, I don't know whether he had a guitar or banjo or whatever he played, but he would play, he would sing and collect money to be sent back for the liberation of people here. So anyway, a very interesting character who received all kinds of awards in Europe. He travelled to Poland, Russia, and all sorts of other places. So he's just one of many. I mentioned some of those other African Americans who were in Britain: Fred Douglass, William Wells Brown, Linda Brent, and in fact, as far as the abolitionists were concerned, there was a kind of story going around that there were more African American abolitionists in Britain than there were in the US at one period, because there were so many people. William and Ellen Craft, you mentioned anybody, lots of people came. And then you have others like Fisk Jubilee Singers, then the cast of Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was a kind of major success in Britain. So in the 19th century, it became a very popular destination for African Americans, not just abolitionists or performers, but others who wanted to travel to Europe for various reasons. So in the book, I mentioned some of these. Obviously, I couldn't mention everybody, but just to give a kind of flavour of what people did and what people thought about their experiences. Okay, let's carry on. Okay, so this woman's name is Fanny Eaton, and she's a little bit unusual. She's originally from Jamaica, and she came to Britain in the mid-19th century. She was a very poor woman with, I think she had 10 children in total. She worked as a cleaner, as a cleaner in, anyway, a very impoverished situation. And it's very unusual, especially in Britain, for us to know very much about the lives of poor black people, we can say, poor people of African and Caribbean heritage, unless they appear in court records or records of that kind. But in her case, she had a kind of unusual occupation, as well as being a cleaner and seamstress. She was also an artist's model, and she was an artist model for the Pre-Raphaelite school of painters. And so her image appears in many paintings. This is just a sketch, but she was often used by some of the Pre-Raphaelite artists and so on. So we know much more about her life. We've got pictures and images of her and so on. But I just put her there just to illustrate, or just to mention that, of course, there were hundreds, in fact thousands of people of African heritage. Certainly in the 18th century, we were talking about like 10,000 or so. More. 19th century, maybe not quite as many, but certainly quite significant numbers of people. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, well, this guy is another very interesting character. His name was Jules Celestine Edwards, originally from the Caribbean, but he spent a lot of time in Britain in various capacities. He was I suppose you could say he was a lay preacher and a lecturer, and he used to attract crowds of thousands of people up and down the country. He spoke on a variety of subjects. he certainly spoke on sort of Christian themes, and he kind of lectured people on, yes, on a variety of subjects. But he was also a campaigner against racism, against imperialism of that period. Quite an unusual figure in many ways, but illustrates something that was developing in that period, not just amongst people of African or Caribbean heritage, but more generally. He wrote about the so-called scramble for Africa, the contention for African colonies amongst the big powers in the 19th century. And then he worked with some rather interesting people, like Ida B. Wells, for example. He organized her tour of Britain at the end of the 19th century. And he was also an editor of two separate newspapers, publications, that also featured Ida B. Wells and a whole anti-lynching campaign and so on. So in many instances, as I indicated at the beginning, we find connections between those in Britain and obviously our people here on various issues. Okay, let's move on because we've got quite a long way to go yet. Okay, well, this is another example of those connections. This is Samuel Coleridge Taylor, the famous classical composer, who wrote, his aim was to, I suppose you could say, integrate what he would have called African themes into classical music. So he used things like spirituals. You can find his arrangements of things like Deep River and these kinds of songs. But he was also very popular here. I was born in the outskirts of London in the 1870s. He worked very closely with people like Paul Laurence Dunbar. They cooperated together. He gave concerts. I think he actually gave a concert here at the White House during his period. A very significant classical composer. Unfortunately, he died at a very early age of 37. So his career, his work wasn't continued. But you can still find recordings of some of his work around if you're interested. His most famous work, Hiawatha's Wedding Feast, based on the poem that you probably all learned at school. I don't know whether people still learn that at school here. But anyway, he produced a choral work. I know some of you guys are really into that kind of thing. So you can check it out. Okay, let's go. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the 20th century. And these are just examples. I'm using, obviously, individuals just to present something of the history. So this guy's name is Walter Daniel Toll. And you guys probably don't know very much about football in England, which is a very important subject. So Walter Daniel Toll was one of the earliest black football players. And he played for a very important team that I won't go into now. But anyway, it's very in England it's a very important team. So he's known for being a footballer, but he also had another. He was also celebrated for another reason. That is that during the First World War, he became an officer in the British Army. Now, at this time, for reasons I won't go into now, the British Army, like many aspects of society in Britain, was openly racist. Racism was essentially legal in a sense that there were no laws to prevent racism, a bit like here. So there was a law or a regulation that if you were not a person of pure European descent, you could not be an officer in the British Army. But during the First World War, he became an officer. He was a lieutenant, or lieutenant, as you say here, which was quite unusual. In fact, he was the first British-born black person to become an officer. There were other people who were officers from the Caribbean and from Africa for reasons I won't go into. But he was the first British-born. And because of the way history is represented in Britain, this is, it becomes a big deal. Somebody fought in the war, became an officer, and so on. Nobody necessarily thinks about what kind of war it was. And why was somebody fighting in this war and so on. So that's another question that's always important to consider. Not just that, people of African heritage or Caribbean heritage fought in the war, but what was this war all about? Anyway, we can go into that maybe with the next slide. But anyway, that's Walter Daniel Toll. Let's have the next one. So this is rather more interesting to me. This is somebody who didn't fight in the war. And as you probably know, during the First World War, some people took a stand against that war. And this guy's name was Isaac Hall. You can probably just about read the stand that he took and why he took that stand. And he has a very clear analysis of what the war was all about, what the big powers were doing. They were dividing up Africa and so on and so forth. As he says, they're amongst the worst oppressors and so on and so on. And so he refused. And he was imprisoned for his beliefs, tortured, and eventually kind of rescued from prison in Britain. We don't know very much about what happened to him afterwards. We think that he went back to Jamaica. In fact, we're not even sure that this particular quotation comes from Isaac Hall. Isaac Hall is known as a conscientious objector, which is what people who refused to participate were called. But it's actually possible that it's from somebody else. We're not sure about. I'm not sure about that yet. I'm not sure about it. But it's just an illustration that people took a stand, and in this case, a Jamaican took that stand and was prepared to go to prison and follow the consequences. Of course, hundreds of thousands of Africans, people of African and Caribbean heritage, contributed to that war and gave their lives in that war, and so on. But why it was fought, it was essentially fought to redivide the world between the big powers, as you see there. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Okay, so here we have another interesting figure from Britain's history. This is Dusa Muhammad Ali, who was many things, best known perhaps as an editor of a very important publication, the African Times and Orient Review, which some of you may have heard of, which was produced from, in fact, during the period of the First World War, from about 1912 to 1920. It's one of the first, African publications in Britain. Dusa Muhammad Ali claimed that he came from Egypt. No one's really sure exactly where he came from. There was some speculation that he didn't come from Egypt. But he's a very interesting and influential figure. He later came here and worked very closely with Marcus Garvey, with John Edward Bruce and lots of other interesting people. And later on went to Lagos in Nigeria and was engaged as a newspaper editor there. In fact, he gave Garvey one of his first jobs, I guess you'd say, as a journalist in Britain in 1914. And so then came here and was very influential. His publication was also interesting in the British context because it began to initiate one of the first black beauty contests. I know beauty contests are rather frowned on these days, but in the period of the First World War, having a black beauty contest was, you could say, quite an enlightened thing to do. And so he was planning to have a beauty contest in the pages of the African Times Review. In the end, that didn't take place for various reasons, but that was one of his proposals. Okay, let's go on to the next one. He was strongly under the surveillance of the security services in the US, in Britain, and in many other countries. So he's quite an interesting character. Okay, so I'm moving on to the 1920s, and one of the features of the 20th century in Britain is we have many more organizations being formed of Africans, people from the Caribbean, also Pan-African organizations. This is one of the first, the Nigerian Progress Union from 1924. It's interesting because it was jointly founded by this woman sitting here. That's Amy Ashwood Garvey, the first wife of Marcus Garvey, as you know, was here for a while, but spent a lot of her life in Britain as an activist, restaurateur, impresario, a whole range of range of occupations. Again, these organisations were often formed to fight against racism. As I said, the colour bar, as it was called, was widespread. Black people found it very difficult to find accommodation, and obviously to find jobs and all sorts of other. In all areas of life, there was this problem of racism. Okay, let's move on. And here's Amy Ashford Garvey again. This one's taken from the 1930s in Trafalgar Square in the heart of London. And this is a demonstration protesting against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia or Abyssinia, which was a very, very important cause at that time here in Britain, throughout Europe, in Africa, the Caribbean, everywhere. Let's just go on to the next slide. This is another demonstration on the same issue. This one taken from Wales in the 1930s. It's around 1935, 1936. You can see the signs. They're also demonstrating against war and for peace. This is interesting. It's a kind of demonstration. Probably all these guys are communists. Communism was popular then. Maybe not quite so popular now. Yeah, talk about that later. Anyway, yeah, I won't tell you the story of that. Let's go on to the next slide. So I'm moving on to the Second World War, and again, just to emphasize this question of the colour bar. So this young woman was born in East London, and as you can see, this is a poster, a campaign against racism, and it's pointing out that, okay, we're in the middle of a war that's supposed to be fought against fascism and all this kind of thing. And yet when this woman tried to join what in Britain was called the Land Army, which was a kind of a scheme to get women in particular working in agriculture to support the war effort, she tried to join that organisation and they wouldn't let her join. So this was a protest, and it said even though her brother and father are in the Navy and risking their lives and so on, this is the level of racism in Britain in the middle of the war. And there are many other examples. In fact, it gives one other example here of somebody who was barred from a hotel in central London and so on. Okay, let's move on. Well, this is also a wartime picture, and Greg mentioned the Young Historians Project. So this was a Young Historians Project is a project that we have for young people of African and Caribbean heritage in Britain between the ages of 16 and 25, and we started it whenever that was 7 or 8 years ago, because there were so few young people taking up history as a career or taking up history at university. In fact, we found that amongst young black people, history was the third most unpopular subject. Only agriculture and veterinary science were more unpopular. And so we began to look into that a little bit more. And obviously there were various obvious reasons, the Eurocentrism of the curriculum, the way history is taught in schools, universities and so on. So we thought it was very important to encourage young people to engage with history. And it wasn't that people were not interested in history, but they weren't interested in the kind of history that was being presented to them. So we began this project, and which essentially enables young people to investigate something they want to investigate and then present their findings to their peers and to the wider community through film, exhibition, podcast, murals, you name it, they do it. And this particular young woman, her name was Adewale Ademola. She came from Nigeria, and she was a nurse in Britain during the Second World War. The reason we have these photos of her was that a film was made about her during the Second World War. But as is the nature of these things, this film has been lost. So we don't have the film. But we have some stills from the film. So the Young Historians Project did some investigation about her life and wrote about her and so on. So that's why I've included the image here. Yeah, the problem of things being lost is anyway a particular problem that we have. So the young historians did a project on African women and the health service in Britain. And I should explain that, you know, African women have been part of the health service in Britain for at least a century, actually longer than that, but are generally unrecognised. You won't find anything written about them and so on. So the young people did some of the only research that's been done on that subject. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Well, Nurse Ademola, as she was known, was a member of this organisation, the West African Students' Union, one of the most important African organisations in Britain, founded in 1925. And although it's called a students' union, it was actually a kind of political organisation campaigning against colonialism, against racism, for the rights of Africans. It had its own branches in throughout West Africa and Nigeria, Gold Coast, Gambia, Sierra Leone. And it had some connections here. And I was doing some research years ago here at Howard, went into the archives, and I haven't brought it with me tonight, but I suddenly saw something, just a mention of something. West African Students' Union. I thought that's very strange. Why is there something about West African Students' Union in DC? And we went into the archives, wherever they are, over the road somewhere, and they brought out this poster, which I haven't got here. There was a poster, it must have been probably about 5 foot high, something like that, from 1930, I think it's about 1933. It looked as though it had never been unfolded since 1933. I've never seen it. I've spent a lot of time studying this organisation. Most of their archives are in Nigeria. I've never seen this poster before. It's basically advertising their journal, saying it's available all over the world. It's a beautiful poster. And it was here in DC. So anyway, what that story tells you is that when you're researching history about any particular subject or organisation in one place, you never know where you're going to find information about it. What it was doing at Howard, nobody knew. The archivist didn't know how it got there. It just happened to be there for some reason. But probably because these guys had connections in the US as well. Yeah.
Before we get too far off of the last picture, can you speak to, because this is a piece of our history that I've never really known about, what was it, why were there so many nurses of African descent in England? Because there must have been some kind of
Recruitment.
Yeah,
there was. Well, it depends what period you're looking at, but there are two things to say. I mean, and the Students' Union kind of reflects the situation, that under colonial rule, essentially there was no higher education in Africa, or in the Caribbean for that matter. So if you were living, in Jamaica, or you're living in Nigeria, and you wanted to train in some way, or you wanted to really progress your career, there was some training. But if you wanted to get a kind of recognized qualification as a nurse or as a doctor, definitely, or in some other profession, you would probably have to go overseas to find it, because there were no universities or no higher education. So you'd find many people came to Britain. Well, some people from British colonies came here to the US to study. And actually, if you look at the colonial authorities were a bit concerned about people traveling overseas, because they reckon if people came here, they'd become, subverted by, this African Americans and radicals and so on, and of course racism. So they were a bit concerned about people coming to the US. But then in Britain, there was the same problem. So when these guys came to Britain, they may have come from quite well-off backgrounds. When they came to Britain, they just treated like any other black person. They couldn't find anywhere to live. all kinds of problems, blah, blah, and so on and so forth. So that very often radicalized people. They became even more conscious that they were colonial subjects, they had no rights, that they were discriminated against. They formed organizations and so on. So with the nurses, it's similar. In the kind of early part of the century, people came very often to get training or to train as doctors. In the latter part of the 20th century, there was definite recruitment, both in Africa and the Caribbean. And that recruitment continues to this day. And nowadays we talk about brain drain. You know, that there are more, whatever, Ghanaian doctors here in the US than there are in Ghana, or various other places. So that's a bit of a problem. But people are still recruited. I have people in my family who are recruited from Nigeria in the last couple of years. So yeah, it's still happening. So yeah, that's essentially. Okay, let's go on. There's much more I could say about them, but. So this is another picture. This is again from the 1940s, the famous Manchester Pan-African Congress, held, as its name suggests, in Manchester, and the most famous of all the Pan-African Congresses. And when I usually come to the US, I always say that Pan-Africanism was founded in Britain, which it was, of course, in the famous London Pan-African Conference in 1900. Yes, it's just a fact. In fact, most of even the congresses that Du Bois organized, most of them were held in Europe. He managed to hold one in New York, but most of them were held in Europe. But this is the most celebrated of all of those congresses. Here you can see Amy Ashwood Garvey. This congress was attended by people like Kwame Nkrumah, Jomo Kenyatta, and many others. It's celebrated partly because of those who attended it, but also the politics of the time. This is a bit, not a great image, but you can see down with anti-Semitism, Arabs and Jews unite against British imperialism, freedom for all subject peoples, oppressed peoples of the world unite. And my favourite one, Labour in the white skin cannot emancipate itself while Labour in the black skin is enslaved, which is a famous quote from Karl Marx. So the politics was very different from the Du Boisian congresses, although Du Bois also attended this particular congress. So this is also part of, obviously it's Pan-African history, but it's also part of Britain's history. And in fact, the congress was part of the idea of it was to appeal to, you can say, the labour movement in Britain in some ways. And of course it was held largely as a consequence of the founding of the World Federation of Trade Unions, which took place in London in 1945 too. Okay, let's go on to the next one. Let's move on a little bit. Okay, so this is a picture from 1940, well, it represents 1948. So these three good-looking young men are the Turpin brothers. And I can never work out who's who in this picture. The one who's most well known is Randolph Turpin. You heard of Randolph Turpin? You heard of a guy called Sugar Ray Robinson?
Of course.
Yeah, well, Randolph Turpin beat him. So Randolph Turpin is the most famous of the brothers. But there was another brother, I can't remember which one it is. He was known as Dick. His name was actually Lionel Turpin, but he was known as Dick Turpin. He's famous in the British context because he became the first black boxer to hold a British title. Because in Britain, up until 1948, if you were not a person of pure European descent, you could not compete for a boxing title, for a national title. And that colour bar was only broken by Lionel Dick Turpin in 1948. So that just shows you the extent of racism in Britain in that period. Just another example. Okay, let's move on. Okay, well you can, yeah. Okay, we can leave that one. This is actually from the 1950s. Again, racism was still legal, just as it was here. Yeah, let's go on. Well, this is probably some of you recognise her. This is Claudia Jones leading a demonstration. Of course, Claudia Jones was brought up here, or not here, but in the US. Then your government very kindly deported her to Britain, where she was very welcome and campaigned on a whole variety of issues, including this question of immigration. This is from 1961, 62, probably this demonstration. She's become a very celebrated figure in Britain for her activism, for her role in kind of cultural questions and developing a focus on Caribbean Carnival and so on and so forth. So again, this is just another connection between the two countries represented by Claudia Jones. Okay, let's move on, just because of time and so on. Well, this is from the 1970s. This is one of the organisations that existed in Britain. We had a whole kind of era in Britain associated with, we could say, with Black Power. This is one of the organisations that emerged, and you can see that the particular issues they're taking up is racism against kids in schools. At that time, there was a whole range of policies and discrimination, one of which was labelling black kids educationally subnormal and placing them in special schools and special classes and so on. This organisation was known as the Black Liberation Front. It had quite strong connections with the Panthers here, especially with the Cleavers, but also with others. It was part of the International Panther Network, I think it was called. It was established in 1971. It was still going in the 1980s, 1990s. I was involved with it in some ways a little bit later. It was one of many organisations formed in that period. Let's go on with the next one. And the reason why these organisations emerged were for the obvious reasons. And in that period in particular, in the 70s, there was a big problem with, and still a big problem with, we can say with state oppression and state violence, particularly the violence of police, especially against young black men. And there was a whole campaign in the press about young black men and mugging being street robbery. And this is a kind of celebrated case which emerged from those circumstances, the Oval Four. There were many of these cases, but this is one from actually 1972, where 4 young men came out of a subway station and were attacked by a group of white men who turned out to be police officers, law enforcement officers, in disguise, as it were, in plain clothes. So the young men, as you would, defended themselves. Then they were arrested, beaten up, tortured, and charged with various offences for which they were sentenced, and some of them served prison terms, I think up to about 2 years in prison. The most notable of the 4 is a gentleman called Winston True, who subsequently then campaigned for about 50 years. And I think 2 years ago, he was finally acquitted and cleared because it was found, not because of anyway, I explained that the police officer who led that case was so corrupt that he ended up in prison himself. But although the authorities clearly knew that, they did nothing about it. They didn't look into any of the cases that he was involved in. It came out accidentally in another unrelated case, and so Winston got to know about it and was able to use that evidence to exonerate himself and his friends. But it's just an example of, if you like, the similarities maybe that exist in our two countries. Let's go on for the next one. Okay, so this is my very good friend Aji, who I went to university with, and this is her son Sheni. Now, unfortunately, this is a rather sad story because Sheni still jet lagged, 11, 12 years ago, was admitted to hospital, actually as an outpatient. He became agitated, you can say. The hospital authorities, as they tend to do in Britain, called the law enforcement officers. I think about 10 police officers came to the hospital where they took his life. So this is one of many cases that we've had in Britain over the years, and they still continue to this day. And so when the terrible events of 2020 took place here, they resonated very strongly with people in Britain. So have the next slide, if you've got a moment. So this is one of the images from 2020. You may not know here that we had the sort of largest demonstrations in Britain, probably since of anti-racist nature, probably since the 18th century.
Very quickly, I'm sorry. Very important. They're locking the parking lot next door, so if you have parked there, I would move my car. No one else.
Only the people who work at Howard have parked in that particular lot. So so this is, as I say, probably the largest demonstrations. I mean, literally up and down the country. We have an expression in Britain from Land's End to John O'Groats, meaning the length of the country. Even in small villages, you find these kinds of demonstrations. And of course, people demonstrated kind of in solidarity with what was going on here, but more importantly, raised issues about Britain and state violence, police violence, other forms of racism, and so on. And one of the things that people also mentioned was the question of history, and what kind of history is being presented in schools and universities and so on in Britain, and demanded that there should be a change and so on, as we've been demanding for many, many years. That change, you can say, is ongoing, but it's very, very slow, and in fact there's been a kind of kickback, particularly after the years following 2020, in various ways. You're probably familiar with the issue of the statue, and you heard this. Okay, so and for those of you who haven't, there was an infamous statue of a criminal, a human trafficker in the city of Bristol. And Bristol was one of the major human trafficking ports in Britain in the 18th century. So this statue had been on display for about 100 years, and the people of that city had complained about it and that it should be removed and so on. And the authorities had refused to act. And then in 2020, the people of that city decided that enough was enough, and they removed and threw it into the sea, which is a very democratic and enlightened thing for them to do. And then the authorities and the government, and so there was a lot of kickback and a big fuss about people are trying to rewrite history, and and all kinds of things were said. So in fact, although there was some kind of positive developments from 2020, the struggle over history in particular has become in some ways much more, in some ways more acute and more public than perhaps it was before, when things were kind of pushed under the carpet more. Now the debate is much more open than perhaps it was before. So the book came out in that, in those conditions, in those circumstances, to try and present all of this history of 2,000 years, of 10,000 years, in an accessible form, so people can read it for themselves. All the evidence is there. People are unsure of things, they can look it up and so on. And so that's it. That's all I have to say to you. As I said at the beginning, we have a little bit of a problem with publishers, as usual. But the book will be around in the next period, so if people are interested, I encourage you to get a copy, have a look, investigate, see for yourself what it's all about. And yeah, what can I say? Thank you for coming and listening. I don't know whether Greg is going to MC or we'll just go ahead. I mean, if people have got questions, then I'm happy to field them. Yeah. Les, I don't know who was first.
Well, my question is, how do you find out, can you trace your history if you're from the Caribbean or Africa in the archives in Europe, or where can you, because like here, it's, you know, they have all these 23andMe nonsense, but where can you, if you're outside of the, in the diaspora from the Caribbean, Africa, would there be records of your ancestors?
Yeah, there'd be some records. Depends how far you want to go back. Of course, there are records of people coming to Britain. Obviously, you can, there are things like shipping records and these kind of things that you can look into. And obviously, there are websites like Ancestry.com and all these kinds of things where you can trace in that way. We also have various archives, obviously, national archives in Britain that will have some records and also have finding aids to help people trace their ancestry. So you could look at that site, and nowadays there are also specialist archivists who specialize in the history of black people, essentially. So they would also help. So yeah, there are those possibilities.
Like in between islands in the Commonwealth, because people moved around from Jamaica to Barbados.
Yeah, I mean, some of that, it would depend on the period. Some of that would be in archives in those islands. So some of that material may not be in Britain and may be in the Caribbean, the particular islands and so on. And similarly with, Africa's, again, more complicated. Some African countries have their own archives, or most have their own archives. It depends. I'm going to actually, maybe I'll tell you a story about my own family history. Anyway, just to illustrate that we always think in terms of archives. And a few years ago, I was in Nigeria and visiting people, and visiting family and so on. And I went to the head of my family and said, I'm very interested in family history. Can you, tell me something about family history? And he said, oh, well, it's funny you should ask that, because he went away and came back with this printed sheet with a family tree on it that went back to, I think, 1805. So where did you get this from? Oh, my son did some work in the archives and so on. So, okay. So I showed it to some other people in my family. So what's this? Where is our ancestor or whatever? They were saying, well, I don't know where this came from. He said, tomorrow we'll take you to meet somebody and she'll tell you the history. So the following day they took me to another member of the family, actually a very old woman, who was my great aunt, I think, my grandfather's last remaining daughter, who was, I don't know how old she was very old. And she told me this history, a history of my grandfather, grandmother, great-grandfather. She said, my great, I always thought everybody in my family came from this particular town. She said, no, your great-grandfather was a slave and was also a prince from Oyo and was captured and brought to this. Anyway, she told me this on history. So I used to tell people this story and say that, look, we often look at what is printed or what comes from archives, but actually equally importantly is oral history, family history, history that's passed down, which is sometimes just as accurate, if not more accurate. So the story has a kind of another ending to it because years later, this family tree that I said the head of my family gave to me, I actually got into correspondence with the person who'd compiled it, who was another member of my family. So I said to him, "Oh, where did you get all this from?" He said, "Oh, well, I talked to various people in the family." So he hadn't been to any archives, or he may have been to one or two archives. And he'd actually talked to the same person who had told me the history, to such an extent I could even argue with him and say, "Well, that's not what she told me. She told me this, this, and this." So anyway, all this to show that, again, oral history, family history, things that are passed down and so on, can be just as important as what we think we're finding in archives. And what's found in archives isn't always accurate. There can be all kinds of mistakes and so on. So as historians, we have to look at a whole range of information, or we try to look at a whole range of information in order to, anyway, to make an assessment. So often starting with family is a good way to go. You know, you could follow the path of Alex Haley, I guess. Anyway, not too much, not too much. But anyway, starting with family history. Don't follow it too much; you get sued. Yeah.
Great, lovely presentation. As a historian, I imagine you look to the future. What do you see for the future of black people in England? Particularly as I look at the numbers, and England's like 95% white, and it's not really a small group of people of colour in the few big cities. What do you see as our future in England?
Well, as a historian, I don't look to the future that much in that sense. But, I think that, I mean, the thing about looking to the future is learning from the past. And, you know, I always say to my students that history is not, in a way, is not about the past. History is kind of about the present, because it's helping us to understand the world in which we live. And so understanding the world in which we live, not just understanding it, but understanding it in order to change it. So our future then is dependent to some extent on us and what we do. And one of the things history teaches us is that, you know, we are the agents of change. We determine how the world develops. And I think one of the reasons why history is kind of fought over so much is that the powers that be don't want us to have this understanding of the world. Because their presentation of history is that the one thing they say is ended, or they will tell you that history is kind of made by the white men of property, the great and the good, and the majority of people have no say and no place in history. But when you study history, you find the opposite, that it's actually made by the majority of people acting, you know, in various ways. And we can look at recent history of this country, or we can go to, you know, something like, you know, the Great Revolution in Haiti, where most of the people are actually enslaved. But they decided that they wanted to change things, rose up, were able to defeat, you know, the three major armies of Europe, the French, the Spanish, the British, and to liberate themselves and do all the things that they did. So our conception of the future is based in a way on what we want, what do we need, what do we demand, and so on. And by understanding that we can affect change, and that, you know, the struggle that we're engaged in to affect that change is related to the struggles of other people in Britain, for example. You could say that, you know, anyway, the situation, the demographics in the US are a little bit different, but they're not so different. It's not just it's not just a situation of, you know, black people, as Thomas Hardy was saying. You have to also be concerned with the problems that other people are facing, because we're all, you know, facing similar problems. I mean, in Britain at the moment, you know, half the country is on strike because of the conditions that people face and the need to take action and so on. So if you look at all that, then you say, okay, what kind of country do we need to be in where people's needs are satisfied and so on? It's the same kind of thing here, where there's very big struggles going on. And that struggle is really about, it's really about who decides everything. Should it be decided by a few millionaires and billionaires? Or should it be decided by those who produce all the wealth which the millionaires and billionaires take and put in their pockets? And we understand that if we allow the millionaires and billionaires to keep doing that, it's going to be disaster and crisis. But if those who produce all the wealth say, well, actually, well, then we should decide everything as well. And if we decide everything and put the majority of people in the center of things, then all these problems can be sorted out. Whether they're problems, economic problems, or issues of racism, or issues of women, or issues of war, peace, and health, and all these things can be sorted out. Especially in a country like this, that has so much wealth. Everything can be sorted out. And as I say, those who create the wealth, who produce everything, who do everything, don't have any decision-making power, although some people claim it's a democracy. But you don't decide anything. The millionaires and billionaires, can I say that? Yeah, millionaires and billionaires decide everything. And that's why I said we have the same system, because they perfected this system in Britain first. They had two parties. And when they first had the system, they didn't get anyone to vote. They just had two parties. And then people struggled a little bit, and struggled a bit more, and they said, okay, well, we'll give them a vote. It's not going to make any difference. And so now every few years you can put a cross on a piece of paper and another millionaire will come into the White House. And then things, get a bit more crisis and say, well, we put a black guy there. And I remember coming, I was speaking here, and somebody, I don't know, I can't remember what the panel was, and somebody asked me, what do you think of him? What do you think change he will bring? And I said, well, he's not going to bring any. People said, what? I thought I wouldn't get out alive. But if the system doesn't change, how is one person going to make any difference? There's no logic to it. Anyway, you lived through it, so you know what the answer to the question is.
Professor Adi.
Yeah.
My question is, and thank you for the presentation. My question is, what do you think is like the unique experience or the unique message of African people in British history, if you kind of had to sum it up, as compared to the rest of Europe?
So the unique.
I said, what's unique about the Black experience in Britain as compared to the rest of Europe? What do you think makes it unique, if anything?
I wouldn't say there's necessarily anything unique. Obviously, people have. Essentially, the history is one of struggle of various kinds. If you look at the history, however far we want to go back, people trying to go back. But go back to the things we've just been talking about. People to kind of change their lives, especially if we go back, 500 years or so. People to change their situation and so on. And I think it's a kind of similar situation in Europe. The numbers are a little bit different in some countries, depends which countries you go to. But obviously there's very big African and Caribbean populations in France. Some other countries not quite so big, but people face very similar problems, very similar difficulties, because for the same reason that the political systems, the economic systems are very similar. And also because in the last 500-600 years, people have gone through the same world system, the capital-centered system, which has been based on the exploitation of Africa and so on. So then it has the anti-African racism and all those features. So people are dealing with very similar problems, economic problems, political problems, social problems of inequality and these kinds of things. So what is unique about it is, it took place in British conditions, in a country which was the biggest colonial power and the biggest human trafficking power of the 18th century and so on. So those are the conditions, but I don't think there's anything that's peculiar to Britain necessarily that's that much different from France. Or, you know, when you go to those countries, you talk to people, it's similar kinds of experiences. They tend to think that we're a little bit better off in England than they are in, say, Germany, where the black population is a little bit smaller and so on, in different circumstances. But I don't think there's anything, that much different.
I think we have time for 2 more questions.
Okay, let's have one here and then one here.
Thank you, Professor, for your presentation. My name is Kamal Grimes. I'm here at Sankofa, and my question is 2 questions. I might have missed it. The woman on the cover, I wanted to know who was she and what caused you to put her on the cover. And then the second question was, do you have any? Did you write in your book at all about Haile Selassie and when he was in exile during the Italian invasion, when he was in exile in Britain? And did you write a bit about Bob Marley and also just the Rastafarian community in Britain?
Yeah, okay, well, just to take the second question first. Yeah, there's something about the Rastafari community, particularly in the, obviously there's, although it's quite a big book, it's covering a very long period of time, and so it's difficult to say a lot about everything. But Rastafari is mentioned particularly in context of the 1970s. So the 1970s, Rastafari was quite important in Britain. Not to say it's not important now, but it was maybe had a greater significance then because it was had a big influence on young people, young black people, especially I would say those from the Caribbean, but also beyond that. And it became I have to be careful what I say because people, but it provided, let me put it this way, it provided a kind of culture of resistance, which obviously was identified or connected with music and with reggae music in particular, not necessarily with one particular artist, but with music and with other aspects of that culture, like the whole kind of sound system culture, which was a big thing in the 70s. Which enabled people to get together and to listen to a kind of music which, had a particular message to it at that time. Maybe it doesn't quite have the same message or the message in the same strength as it did today, but certainly at that time, the kind of music that people were listening to, which very often referred to Babylon in its various forms, and to liberation, and talked about history and so on and so forth, which was very, very important. So that's mentioned in the book. As far as the cover picture, I'm a bit jet lagged, so I've forgotten her name, but it's on the cover. It should be on the cover. She was, I can't read it now, but she was. The picture is basically presented because it's a beautiful picture. And it's a picture of a woman, and it's a picture of an African woman. She was the wife of, the daughter-in-law of Bishop Ajayi Crowther, who was a famous, Nigerian cleric of the 19th century, so she was his daughter-in-law. It's and it's in the form of a kind of visiting card. So that's why it was chosen. The person herself is not particularly significant in that sense that she's a particularly significant figure, but the photo is a very significant photo because there are not that many images from the 19th century of women dressed in this way and looking at us in the way that she's looking at us. That's why it was chosen. Yep.
The question about Haile Selassie, and there was a time when he was in exile when the Italians invaded, and I know he was in Britain during that time. So I didn't know if you wrote about that.
I can't actually remember if I did, to be honest with you, but I may have mentioned it. But he was a little bit controversial in the things that he said during that period, because he was asked. He was actually interviewed. He was met when he arrived in Britain. There was a delegation of people that met him, of African and Caribbean people that met him at the station. And he was subsequently interviewed. I can't remember the exact form of the interview, but there was a question of, to what extent was he see himself as a representative of Negroes throughout the world. And he said, well, he wasn't a Negro, and made remarks of that kind. So he became a little bit a controversial figure amongst African and Caribbean people during that period. As did Marcus Garvey, actually. Because Marcus Garvey, in the period at the end of his life, was, maybe getting out of step with the younger radical people at the time, people like George Padmore and Isaac Wallace Johnson. And there's a tradition in Britain of people speaking at Hyde Park. And, anyone can get up and speak. And Garvey would speak, and people would come along and criticise him and say he's talking nonsense and so on. So all things have to be seen in their context, historical context. So I can't remember if Haile Selassie is mentioned in the book. He may be, but okay, thank you for looking up. I forgot. So he is. So yeah, you can check that out. What do I say about him? Okay, fine. Okay, yeah.
Okay, sorry, it wasn't on. Thank you so much, Professor Adi, for sharing your book with us. I wondered what you thought about public memorials, particularly those that are being put up to people of African descent and others, and the London mayor's moved to establish this commission on diversity in the public space. I mean, are these things important? I mean, should we, the Mary C. Cole statue, Terry Gross Memorial, these kinds of things, how important are those pieces to see, black people reflected in public spaces?
Well, I mean, it's good to have kind of public memorials and public representations of black people, because at the moment there are very few. I suppose the question is really who decides these things, without getting embroiled in matters of London Mayor and so on. But the issue there is, who decides these things. There have been various mayors' commissions. I sat on a mayor's commission about 20 years ago. How long ago was it? Yeah, nearly 20 years ago now. And it's all been forgotten about. So, Britain has a history of commissions. So if there's a problem, we'll have a commission. And people will forget about it. So, we had a mayor's commission in 2005, which was on questions of heritage and culture and so on. All kinds of people were interviewed, gave evidence. Various people made all sorts of promises that they were going to change this, that, and the other. And very little has changed.
So we should be doing it ourselves then, you're saying?
We should always do it ourselves. We should always do it ourselves. It doesn't mean that, being involved in official things and so on is necessarily wrong, but at the end of the day, who decides? Who's going to implement? How's it going to be implemented? And so taking initiative, I mentioned Young Historians Project earlier. When we started that, we went to all the organisations that should have been concerned about the fact that young black people were not engaging in studying history and were being turned off history. We went to all of them and asked them what were they doing, and none of them were doing anything. And so we took it on ourselves to organise a conference and to set up various things like the Young Historians Project, which may not, I'm saying they will necessarily solve the problem, but they will do something to change things and to create the conditions where things can be changed and where young people can do things for themselves and so on. So always, I mean, going back to the question that the brother there asked about what is the future starts now. So what we do tonight, tomorrow. So the whole issue of seeing our agency in changing things, not waiting for Obama to come and change them or somebody else to change them. But we have to be the ones who change things, who initiate things. And that's what history shows us. This is how change has been made. Well, look at any of the history of this country. You will see it time and time and time again. Even if government may do something, it does it because people demand it and struggle for it. And then you have to check up, are they doing it? No, they're probably not doing it. So again, that comes back to how decisions are made, how they're implemented, who are the decision makers. So are we the decision makers? No. If we're not, then it's probably not going to happen. So to have that thinking of what does it mean to be a decision maker? How do we become decision makers? Is probably one of the kind of key questions of this century. So that's what we have to be thinking about.
Thank you.